I'm so happy to be here. Oh gosh, okay, let's see. There we go. All right, I'm hoping I'm good there with my screen and all. I'm going to jump right in. I timed this and I should be pretty good, so I'm just going to get started here. The idea of giving this presentation a title about an emerging spiritual imaginary and using the word imaginary came from the reading of Charles Taylor's important work, A Secular Age. And in that book, Taylor speaks, when he speaks about the tensions and cross tensions of religious and non-religious belief at play in the Western psyche throughout the centuries, he often spoke of what he termed the prevailing social imaginary. So you can think of it as a kind of Wittgensteinian picture or lived background that captures us, whereby it's only possible for us to see things in a particular way. From a Gebserian standpoint, we could think of it as the orienting nature of the states of consciousness. Gebser, of course, goes to great lengths in the ever-present origin to describe them to us. There are pivotal events which can shift the social imaginary that knock us out of a particular and prevailing worldview. And examples would be things like Copernicus's discovery of heliocentrism, the birth of Orthodox religions during the Axial Age, the Reformation, the first man walking on the moon, Arab Spring, or even images from the James Webb Telescope. But what of the spiritual imaginary? And Gebser writes, the grand and painful path of consciousness emergence, or more appropriately, the unfolding and intensification of consciousness manifests itself as an increasingly intense luminescence of the spiritual in man, woman. In the ever-present origin, Gebser discusses the spiritual in concurrence with the mutual, in concurrence with the mutation of integral consciousness. And this emerging spiritual imaginary, as I'm calling it, and which Gebser refers to as the concretion of the spiritual, is a double movement within his description of the integral. It emerges forth in integral consciousness as part of systasis, a conjoining or fitting together of parts into integrality that is a conjoining of the most efficient facets of all states of consciousness as they've unfolded over the millennia. And it's through this time-free diaphaneity, and it must be time-free for the diaphaneity to be made possible, that the epiphany of the spiritual opens fully to our consciousness. And yet, as in Gebser's words, concretion does not mean a transformation of the intangible into something tangible or substantial, but rather the completion of concrescere from the Latin, meaning in being together to grow, prosper, thrive. That is the coalescence of the spiritual within our consciousness, and with its concrescence, there's an awareing of truth. The spiritual then, in his expression of it, becomes like the air that we breathe. It's transparent. It's a consciousness of itself as it supersedes the dualistic subject-object divide, is time-free, and has no spatial loci. And yet, its ever-present originary nature presents another movement. Being ever-present and originary implies that it also has an impetus and an a priori given in the great unfolding of life, of the cosmos and the geosphere, biosphere, noosphere of our individual planet. Borrowing from Teilhard de Chardin with echoes of Plato, there's a within of things that accompanies all that we see in its exteriority of form. Gebser seems in agreement when he writes, the phenomenon releasing origin is spiritual, and with each consciousness mutation, it becomes more realizable by man, woman. So before moving ahead and exploring examples of where the spiritual seems to be making an emergence, let's talk for a moment about enchantment. I was in an introduction to philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness class at CIS when I first saw this chart as created by cosmologist, historian, and scholar Richard Tarnas. I've made a few minor additions based on my reading of Charles Taylor. It illustrates the transition from the primal enchanted worldview of the anima mundi to our current modern state of general disenchantment. In primal enchanted times, there was not only the structure of the world and cosmos, but a kind of spirit, transcendence, or consciousness that permeated everything. As I've just mentioned, Teilhard de Chardin pointed out in his evolutionary view of life, that's life with a capital L, that for every outward manifestation, there's an accompanying inner existence or unfolding, as he eloquently states it, a within of things. From a Gebserian view, we can think of this primal enchanted consciousness as the states of magical and mythical, or as unperspectival consciousness. Charles Taylor describes the early humans of this time as porous, entangled, unfiltered, and completely unbuffered from the nature world and transcendence around them. They were nature, they were transcendence. The underlying energetic or within of things was first given name by Plato in 360 BC, who called it the anima mundi or world soul. He wrote in Timaeus, "Thus then, in accordance with the likely account, we must declare that this cosmos has verily come into its existence as a living creature, endowed with soul and reason, a living creature, one invisible, containing within itself all the creatures which are by nature akin to it." With modernity, there came a distancing and impartial view of things that was fed by orthodox religion, the modern moral order, and the mechanistic and rationalistic gaze of science. The anima mundi, which had pervaded all, was now only the domain of men, and I'm using man because at the time it was a very man-dominated world. Dualism set in, the world of subject-object, and humans as one step removed from it all, invulnerable, with an amplified authoritarian control over the supposedly soulless objects that lay outside them. Humans were the only keepers of any type of soul, and eventually, too, the idea of there even being a soul became questionable. In essence, humans became buffered selves living in a buffered world. Akil Bilgrami, professor of philosophy at Columbia, writes in his essay, "What is Enchantment?" how the buffered self is a self that's not open to normative demands from any site external to itself, an inevitable consequence of the fact that a world conceived as brute does not in any case contain anything that could make those demands. The shadow of the buffered self is that we are isolated in a world of our own making that lacks meaning since it's littered with soulless atomistic objects and is cage-like in its shallow constraint. As early as 1930, Teilhard de Chardin mentions this crisis in its psychic manifestation when he writes, "Something threatens us, something is more than ever lacking, but without our being able to say exactly what." Charles Taylor notes that this malaise is specific to a buffered identity whose very invulnerability opens it to the danger that not just evil spirits, cosmic forces, or gods won't get to it, but that nothing significant will stand out for it. In its wake, there comes a longing for the numinous, for the transcendent, and for the spiritual. In general, this longing for the spiritual appears to be less and less fulfilled by Orthodox religion, at least in the Western realm. If we use the US as an example, over the past 25 years, the importance of religion per se has declined dramatically. A recent series of New York Times articles indicated that 6,000 to 10,000 churches are being shuttered each year in the US. However, it's important to note that many people believe but do not belong and are finding transcendence in the spiritual in other ways. Recent images from the James Webb Telescope have clearly fed my own longing for the numinous and emerging spiritual imaginary as we're able to look into the depths of the cosmos and witness the life and death of stars and galaxies that emerged some 13.8 billion years ago. This beautiful poetic promise, however, is met with a significant deficient mental consciousness presence, that of the powering over, capitalistic-driven industrial complex of cosmology and astrophysics, as pointed out by Bjorn Erkberg in his recent book, Metaphysical Experiments. There have been recent questions about the realism imparted through the theory of relativity and theoretical quantum formulations that make up the standard model of cosmology. As Ekberg details in his book, and the New York Times opinion piece substantiates, the standard model of cosmology is way off. We're lost in an array of abstraction built upon abstraction, Things like theories of dark energy and dark matter have been added to explain that which scientists are unable to explain, which is roughly 95% of the cosmic picture. In true deficient mental consciousness fashion, we've stepped outside the cosmos via depths of abstractionism in order to try and know it. Eckberg finally asks, is our understanding of the cosmos today really so much more profound than that of our ancestors? Looking up to the night sky reminds us of our primordial and enchanted stardust roots. Brian Swimme and Mary Tucker, in their book Journey of the Universe, write, this universal story has the power to awaken us more deeply to who we are, for just as the Milky Way is the universe in the form of a galaxy, and an orchid is the universe in the form of a flower, we are the universe in the form of a human. And every time we're drawn to look up into the night sky and reflect on the awesome beauty of the universe, we're actually the universe reflecting on itself, and this changes everything. If this presentation were to have a theme song, it would be an anthem from the 1960s Cultural Revolution, Woodstock, written by Joni Mitchell. It intones the essence, mood, and spirit of that movement, epitomized by 3 ritualistic days in August of 1969, when 500,000 people gathered at Yaskar's farm. The night sky, as shown here, revealed an archetypically intense Pluto and revolutionary-driven Uranus in a once every 100 years or so conjunction. The song's lyrics, reminding us that we are stardust and that we've got to get ourselves back to the garden, is as relevant now as it was then. Gebser makes clear in his writings that whether we flourish or perish is clearly in our own hands, not in an anthropocentric controlling way, but in our capacity as humans to coalesce with the spiritual that is origin and wholeness. He believes it's possible. He cites that there have been those in history who have already been able to achieve this integral mutation. He cajoles us, wanting to break us out of our disenchanted malaise, which romantic poet Christoph Wilhelm Höfland, whom Gebser quotes, terms as being half-born. Only a new strength of spirit, kindled from a primordial divine source, can create a new wellspring of life in the lifeless multitude, which will surely engender a new life, purity, freshness, and strength in physical nature. The half-born must come to full birth. So let us give the half-born full birth. Let us look to our primordial, unbuffered ancestors who lived in the plenum of transcendence to guide us toward this coalescing spiritual imaginary. In the words of Gebser, we look not through the gaze of retrogression, but in the spirit of reinvigoration at that which we previously and exclusively were previously and exclusively actual and thus effectual. So I've organized our journey of reinvigoration around 3 themes that resonate with the unbuffered sense of enchantment and primordial presence of the anima mundi, all 3 of which I believe support an emerging spiritual imaginary and its concrescence with the integral. The first theme is that of attunement, what we might consider a deep listening to and connecting with the insights offered by a soul-filled world within and around us. In 1059 BC in ancient China, without any sort of light pollution, the stars of the night stood out magnificently. The visible planets, those that don't require a telescope to see them, are Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. The ancient Chinese associated each of these planets with a different element of nature. At this time, the Shang people were the ruling tribe in China. They'd built a large capital at Anyang, which was located about 300 miles south of modern Beijing. Their neighbors to the west were the Zhou, who lived in the Wei River Valley near to present-day Weinan. The Zhou tribal leader was the illustrious King Wan. In 1059 BC, King Wan received a heavenly mandate, or a Tianming. He and his astronomers noted a rare alignment of the visible planets, an alignment which we now know only occurs about every 500 years. The red crow perching on the Zhou altar to the soil, which is how they described it, informed them that it was now time to initiate a shift in power with the ruling Shang. It was time to overthrow them. Here's the configuration of the planets on May 28th, 1059 BC, looking up from Weinan, China. And indeed, all 5 planets are aligned, their orbits being only 6 degrees apart. It took King Wen and his eldest son 14 years of fighting, but eventually the Shang were overthrown, and the highly revered Zhou dynasty was born that lasted some 800 years. The Zhou people were highly renowned for their magnificent bronzes. In 433 BC, this complete set of bells was crafted for the very wealthy Marquis Yi of Jung. There are 64 bells. 64 is a significant number. There are also 64 hexagrams in the I Ching, a divination technique whose origin dates back to 1000 BC. The yarrow stalks were thrown daily by the king's diviners to reveal a hexagram presaging right action for the day. The 64 hexagrams as such symbolized all the potential outcomes of the known universe. And then, as it turns out, as we discovered some 3,000 years later, there are also 64 cordons in the genetic code of our DNA, or the blueprint of human life. So music played on 64 bells might be thought of like playing the music of the universe. It's a deep synchronicity. So this bell set has been replicated so that the bells can be played. And I thought I'd just play just a little bit of this form of enchantment.
Not able to hear, Jessie.
Oh, you're not? All right. I'll stop then. My apologies. I had set share my sound with you all, so I guess that didn't work. The Western turn of disenchantment makes the work of people like Carl Jung all the more amazing. I love this quote from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections because it speaks to Jung's porous and unbuffered way of being that he viewed from his European standpoint as a peculiarity. We might also consider it his own special connection with enchantment and the emerging spiritual imaginary. He wrote, "The difference between most people and myself is that for me, the dividing walls are transparent. That's my peculiarity." The thing about Jung was not only his inherent diaphaneity, but the ways in which he opened to many different types of consciousness. He sought out experiences and took in ways of others not steeped in the severe buffering of the Western world. Even before meeting Richard Wilhelm, Jung was already experimenting with the I Ching. Instead of using yarrow stalks, he cut his own set of reeds and sat for hours playing with them and randomly separating them into bundles to uncover hexagrams. He found there to be amazing coincidences that led him to his ideas about causal parallelism, which he later referred to as synchronicity. And of course, he ultimately wrote the foreword to the English translation of the I Ching, published in 1950, of Wilhelm's original German version. The book became highly revered in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution. And of course, we know about his work with dreams, but I thought I'd share an anecdotal story about his openness and way of being. This story was told by Marie-Louise von Franz in her book Alchemy. So when Jung was in Africa in 1925, which he's pictured here, his safari guide and all the carriers discussed their dreams each morning, after which they'd come to Dr. Jung and let him know if they'd proceed that day or not, based on what their dreams had told them. So Jung always went with their decision and often engaged in their dream discussions with them, and they respected and liked him. But as the story goes, another Englishman who did the same trip some weeks later was killed. Instead of heeding the dreams of the men, he told them that they were lazy and forced his will upon them, and he thus died on the trip. Jung also visited this beautiful pueblo on the outskirts of Taos. There he was able to have several quiet conversations with the Native American elders. One was the chief of the tribe, Mountain Lake, who told him that the white men's features were cruel and that white men were always seeking something, forever seeking, and seemed to be mad, as in insane. When Jung questioned him about this, Mountain Lake said it was because the white men think with their heads and not with their hearts. Again, that sense of disengagement from the world around them. Mountain Lake said, "We are a people who live on the roof of the world. We're the sons of Father Sun, and with our religion, we daily help our fathers to go across the sky. We do this not for ourselves, but for the whole world." One of the great ruptures that resulted from the turn to modern-day disenchantment is what Charles Taylor calls excarnation, or the separation of mind, body, and spirit. Thus, the second theme on the primordial sourcing for the emerging spiritual imaginary is the idea of incarnation, and the body is the transit to the spiritual, or as Sri Aurobindo puts it, the body being a mystic bridge between the spiritual and physical being. The ancient Chinese provide another primordial example of the opening to the spiritual through one's body. They are only one in a tradition of centuries-old body-centered spiritual practices, such as Sufi whirling that dates back to the 13th century, or the far earlier Hindu yogic practices mentioned in the Rig Veda, dating back to 1500 BC. Our point of entry is the Chinese character for the word wu, shaman, wu. In 1400 BC, it was the shaman, who was also often the tribal leader, who navigated the transit between heaven and earth. The etymology of the modern Chinese character for shaman sources from two Shang Dynasty oracle bone glyphs, the earliest known writings of the ancient Chinese. One of the ancient glyphs found in the modern Wu character is the glyph for dance and shows a person with outstretched arms holding oxen tail, an animal that was frequently sacrificed during both the Shang and Zhou dynasties. The definition of the word shaman found in the oldest Chinese dictionary is invocation. They who serve the formless, who with dance bring down the spirits. This manifests in the undulations of their flowing gowns. The dancing of the shaman during healing rituals was presumably quite extraordinary. Dr. Dallas McCurley writes in her article on numinous relations in Shang and Zhou China that the dance as it proceeded would have opened passage between earth and sky in the spinning body of the shaman, now a kinesthetic composite of extraordinary power. The experiencing of the body is also part of the ancient Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where chanting, incense, and meditative stillness all contribute to enlightened experience. I recently had the pleasure of attending a Dharma talk and meditation with the second Kalu Rinpoche of the Shangpa Kagyu tradition, and his Tibetan teachings prescribe the simultaneous practice of yoga, meditation, and toning. And another example from the Western realm that relies upon the lead system of the body for spiritual emergence sources from the Anglican liturgical practice. Catherine Pickstock, English philosophical theologian and participant in the radical orthodoxy movement, writes in her book, Aspects of Truth, about how in the liturgical practice, the senses are intentionally engaged through music, incense, touch, and posture to heighten spiritual intensity and enchant matter so that symbolic objects become hyper-real. She writes, the partially concealed divine order is revealed, lived life becomes infused with spirit, and one is reminded of life's sacredness, to which one gives thanks and continuously as part of the ongoing ritualized liturgical practice. And there's an interesting facet to the lead system of the body being an opening to spiritual emergence. Ian McGilchrist's research into right and left hemispheres of the brain notes how the left hemisphere, the analytic brain, does not have a good integrated sense of the body. The full body is known and felt through the right hemisphere, the hemisphere which is the center of creativity, activated through music, movement, and flow, and attends to the in-the-moment experiencing. The final theme is participatory exchange. This idea is captured by Teilhard de Chardin when he writes, the ego-centric ideal of everyone for himself is false and against nature. No element could move and grow except with and by all the others with itself. The oldest known example of participatory exchange is found at Göbekli Tepe, an ancient site believed to have been active as early as 18,000 BC. It's located in southern Turkey, about 30 miles from the Syrian border, and I had the great fortune of visiting the site in 2013. It was a ritual center and seasonal congregational place for the festive labor of building and carving. There are no villages or any kind of farming nearby. Rather, hunter-gatherers met up there midsummer to autumn to partake of the herds of gazelle, nuts, and cereal grasses that were found in abundance. It's amazing how the Neolithic people came here and who ranged across hundreds of miles were able to find this specific place at a specific time each year so that they could be together in this ritualistic exchange. There's an enchanted record of another version of participatory exchange found in South Africa at the Great Pass Shelter Rock that dates back some 16,000 years, and it involves this magnificent animal, an eland, which is a spiral-horned antelope and was considered sacred. In this rock art, we see depicted a dying eland, and there's a shaman who's holding its tail and shape-shifting into the eland himself, a moment of transference of power from the eland to the shaman. You can see how the man's legs and feet are crossed, just as that of the hind legs of the giant eland. And in Egypt, we see another example of humans intertwined with nature. This image was found on the lid of a box located in the tomb of Tutankhamun. In the image, there's no division between the king, his queen, and the plants living and breathing around them. And it seems important to reference a more recent human-plant merging that happened this summer when 4 children were lost in the jungle after a plane crash, and the native tribal elders in Colombia consulted with ayahuasca in order to learn if the children were still alive and when they'd be found. And the Great Mother, as ayahuasca is often called, confirmed that they were still living and the children were found the next day. I thought I'd close with 2 quotes from Teilhard de Chardin while showing images of 2 participatory rituals. The first is shown here and is out of India. This rock art that dates back to 8000 BC depicts a ritualistic collective in action as we join with people who are holding each other and dancing. In the first quote I want to share, Teilhard de Chardin returns to discussing the within of things and talks about love. He writes, "If there were no real internal propensity to unite, even at a prodigiously rudimentary level, indeed in the molecule itself, it would be physically impossible for love to appear higher up within us in homicized form. By rights, to be certain of its presence in ourselves, we should assume its presence, at least in inchoate form, in everything that is." And the second image of a participatory ritual is the opening ceremony at Woodstock that was led by Swami Satchidananda, whose Sanskrit name means essence, consciousness, and bliss. He was a student of Sri Aurobindo. Teilhard de Chardin writes, "Love in all its subtleties is nothing more and nothing less than the more or less direct trace marked on the heart of the element by the psychical convergence of the universe upon itself. Thus, if I'm not mistaken, is the ray of light, which will help us to see more clearly around us." And I thought I'd just close by leaving everyone with a question. In the time before time, within your unbuffered and diaphanous self, embraced by an enchanted cosmos, what is wanting to awaken? Thank you.